When you pick up a tabletop role-playing game book, you can often get a pretty good idea on what it is you're going to be doing in that game. Like, when you pick up your copy of Vagabond, you can see there's like pulpy heroes fighting a dragon. When you look at your copy of Shadowdark, it's this gloomy portrayal of a dungeon and some creepy monster in it. But when you pick up a copy of Bent Wizards, what are you getting into with this book? Is this even a game? Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and to answer that question, no, this is not a tabletop role-playing game, but it is about tabletop role-playing games. So in today's video, I'd like to dig into Bent Wizards, a recent book from Runehammer, creators of Index Card RPG. And together, let's figure out what a Bent Wizard is and why it is a journey of madness, and by the end of the video, we can determine who this book is for, and then you can make that determination as to whether you should pick up a copy. Now, before we dig in properly, I want to make a brief disclaimer. I consulted with Runehammer on this book, but I am in no way compensated for its sales or for the creation of this video. I bought this copy with my own money, and this isn't a review, an endorsement, or me telling you to go out and buy this copy. This video is simply to explain the contents of this book, to educate you, and then you can make your own decision about whether it's a book you want to pick up. All right. Without further ado, let's dig in. Now, I won't be flipping through every page of this book. It's about 200 pages and is that sort of half US letter size, like Vagabond is, so not quite the same form factor as, say, Shadowdark, but close to it. Instead of flipping through the whole thing, I'm going to flip to some key sections that I've tabbed here that I think demonstrate the insights and value of this book. And then at the end of the video, I'll tell you about who I think this book is for. All right, so let's crack in. So, first thing I'd like to point out is at the very beginning of the book, where it actually tells us really what this book is, but it's a little cryptic. It says, "This book is not the thing, nor is it thinking about the thing. It is thinking about the thing." And if you're like me, that line resonates with you so much. As a tabletop game designer, I can attest to that is how my brain is operating on most days. And I think that's a great indication of what is contained in this book. And this foreword at the beginning of the book is actually very much worth reading if you do end up picking this up, because it gives a clear idea of the vibe and approach that is going to be presented herein. But looking at the table of contents within the Almanac chapter, it tells us that we've got dice systems, character systems, status and meta systems, befuddling factions, death systems, attack and damage, defense and armor, magic and spells, maps, time and turns, equipment, style, theme, layout, and art, and pedagogy and self-knowledge, which we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And this almanac, very precisely named by Runehammer, tells us a lot about the ideology of what's going to be contained in here and how we should approach reading this book. Because it's not something that is necessarily a dry reference book of concepts, but building on sort of mantras and approaches of thinking that can help us think about thinking about things when we're designing tabletop role-playing games. Flipping into the chapter called The Jewel, which is many pages talking about dice systems and how to choose dice, there's a lot of knowledge here, but one thing I wanted to point out that I think is a good indication of the insights in this book is there's this page about the hero die, and it's thinking about how a core dice can become emblematic of your game. Like in something like D&D, right, where the D20 is now like the icon of the hobby. It's the hero die that it uses. And so this is a very insightful comment to make, that when we're designing dice systems, we need to not only think about how they roll, their probabilities, which, are discussed at length in this chapter, but we also need to think about how the experience of those dice facilitate the player experience and how they can become part of the game's vibe itself. And I just think that's very insightful and not something I see talked about frequently. And we won't be going into all of just the interesting math and recommendations that he has here, of course. In the character building section, the chapter called The Wizard, there's another piece of good game design recommendation I'd like to highlight here. So this chapter, which is all about character creation, this little section here about indulging your own characters, this I cannot overstate the value enough. This talks about how when we're making games, when we're making these character build systems, we need to make sure that the character builder sparks joy in us, that the ability to make the characters that we find rad is the heart of character creation. All the rest of the steps can come later, right? All of the nuts and bolts, but making sure that you find joy making these characters is very astute. It's so easy to lose our way and get caught up in spreadsheets and ability matrices and damage types, and to forget about just this joyous aspect, because when you're designing from this direction, other people will find that similar joy. I think that's immensely valuable to reiterate to designers. Jumping way ahead into the chapter called Crabmen, which at first was like, what the heck is this chapter? So Crabmen is about creating factions and structure in a world hard-coded into your game system. And what I wanted to point out that I thought was very insightful here is when you're working on like relational structures for factions within your fictitious game world, in this case we have the Crabmen, the evil wizards, and the beasts. You can start to build out what would be gameplay mechanics that these different relationships and structures would necessitate. And by doing this, which we would say is a top-down approach, you can make mechanics that feel intimately tied to the world itself, to the people and the relationships they have, simply because your mechanical choices are the ones that are needed to reflect that. It's very common with very simulationist games or fully simulationist games to try to simulate everything so that you can account for every situation. But this approach is the way to make sure that what you are simulating is what's actually going to immerse the players in the world, and that will come up naturally in gameplay because the factions and structures of the fictional world necessitate it. That's very insightful. Each one of these little tidbits could be its own game design video, honestly. But this is just obviously a brief review. Here in the Skull, which is about death systems and life, in games and how characters die, has lots and lots of information about different approaches to it, but there's one that I absolutely loved that, again, is highlighting the experiential aspect of dice and tabletop role-playing games in a way that's different from purely mechanical simulation. So in this example, it talks about using the D8 as a die of doom. The D8 of doom. The D8 is used nowhere else in the system, but only for making these death saves. And there's all of these interesting consequences that can come from making the D8 the die of death. For example, it means diamond shapes might be symbols of death in the fiction of the world, and that 8 is the number of death, like the number associated with death, and that there are 8 levels of the nether realm of hell in this world, all because of this association. And all of this means, mechanics aside, that when the players have to pick up their D8, it carries additional meaning in the world and then to the player that makes this experience very special. Juxtapose that to the death saving throw in D&D, which is really just, a 55% chance of success. It doesn't need to be on the D20 per se. But think about how special it would be if there's a special death dice, right? That makes that moment of whether or not you're dead or not very special. this is gold, right? Great insight here. And of course, I immediately enjoyed this book because in the sword section, which is about damage and hurting things, we talk about wounds. There is a discussion of wounds here. Obviously, if I were to have written this book, the wound section would have been 8 pages long. And it does have a discussion here in this book, where it talks about different types of damage structures, how they scale, how to consider the progression over time with damage structures. But I was very happy that there is a wound system mentioned. So the section called The Book is about magic systems, and since I haven't worked in magic systems in a long time, this one kind of blew by me a little bit, but as I'm working on some additional games right now, I need to come back and really ingest this because it does a great job of explaining relational aspects of magic and their use and how you can tie that into the world. So this type of thinking is excellent for creating something that isn't just the raw mechanics, but again, is tied back to the game itself, the game as a whole, taken in aggregate. So the chapter on the island, which is map making and world, like building out a world, is one of the longest, I believe, in the book. And there's too much here to dig into for this video, but something I wanted to point out is just how simple and approachable Runehammer has made map making. So this is talking about simple structures of the rule of 3 when it comes to different zooms, right? Overland down to dungeons, down to individual rooms, and how that can be applied to different aspects of planning. And then like visual plans, which has travel into a dungeon, into even a boss fight, and the boss fight has a rule of 3 associated with it, with these great little drawings. This thinking is a great way to help people like me who can't really draw it. I'm not very good at visually thinking, to better map a dungeon before I've even like attempted to create a grid or any measurements, but to map the moments and key structures of it ahead of time in a very approachable way. Of course, Runehammer draws very well. These are all just simple sketches that he's presenting to us to make it approachable. Obviously, he can draw much better than that, but I appreciate stick figures and little guys because this is only about as good as I would be able to draw. And this chapter goes into detail and applying these guidances in all sorts of different situations that I found very revelatory. And like I said, it goes on and on. Something that was immediately jumped out to me as well in this section is talking about 60-30-10 when it comes to compositions. Now, I have no art background or design background, and so this was really cool to see and how to apply it. So the 60-30-10 composition is about visual clutter and spacing, and he explains it here and then shows an example of building a dungeon based on that ideology, and that's just really helpful for me, who struggles with drawing maps and designing dungeons. It creates a visual balance inherently in your map making, which I just found immensely helpful. Over in the chapter called The Clock, which is about turn structures, this one was pretty well-trodden ground for me, as I think a lot about turn structures already, and it provides this great guidance as to how to figure out what would be the best turn structure for your game. But something that it goes into here in the Doing Backflips subheader is trying to get you to think outside of the very standard way of presenting rules and playing the game. So it has your usual structure here: evaluate, describe, get target number, roll result. But it also says, there's nothing to stop you from rolling to evaluate, then you describe based on that roll. The GM gives you a target, and then we determine the result based on that. That's a different way of approaching it. This is, we would call this input randomization. And that's fascinating, and that's helping kind of break up your mind a little bit from the standard you may be used to. jumping ahead to The Pen, which is about style and presentation of a book. This would be, we often think once you're really far along and you're ready to present things, that's when you worry about it. But this talks about how from the very beginning you can be thinking about this and thinking about how the style of the game can read through visually. And Runehammer actually demonstrates the process by which he created the style of this book here in this example. And I think that's really cool to see. It's fully, honestly revealing the creative process that created the book that you're reading right now. And that's valuable, especially, again, for people like me who are really bad at this. Seeing these concrete examples is immensely helpful. And the last little section I wanted to point out is a little bit more of a personal note. So in the chapter called The Scholar, which is about you watching this video right now or reading this book, it talks a lot about mental energy and bucketing where you can put your time and the stress on the brain. And for those that have been following this channel and kind of know what's going on, I have been extremely stressed and busy because we are in the final production of my tabletop role-playing game, Clockworld. And so most of my days I'm spending editing and reviewing layout examples, approving artwork, handling website stuff, setting up business accounts, just real disconnected stuff from the creative process. And that's very demanding. And throughout this book, and especially in the Scholar section, it talks about the mantra that we can hold in order to maintain a creativity and a sense of lightness as we produce things. And one thing it says at the very beginning of this book was to do things by hand. And this was reminding me of how much I enjoy actually using my notebooks for game design. And so I ended up getting out some of my notebooks again and doing more writing by hand rather than on my computer. This helps ground you in the creative process, disconnects me from all my Discord notifications and emails and YouTube comments, and grounds me back in the creative process with my dice and my notes. And I just found that very satisfying, and it came at the right time, this book, when I was working with Runehammer on it, because I really needed to reground myself in the creative process. Now, I know I've been giving this glowing praise this whole time, but I'd like to give you some things to consider, some warnings, if you will. If you're unfamiliar with Runehammer's writing style, some of the playful erudition of this book might turn you off if you're not accustomed to it. The writing in here is atypical. It is using Runehammer's unique voice, which I enjoy. I enjoy reading this style. I like the playfulness of the language because it's not going for your typical sentence structure, your typical punctuation, your typical word choices. Instead, it's having fun with the language. As an example, this says, "To wit, brave dreamer, every deep dabbler of role-playing games, game mastering, and the tinkering therein reaches a point and thinks the precipitous and perilous thought, I could and shall create my own RPG." Now, I love that kind of stuff, but the book is all written in this kind of style. So take that into account before hitting purchase on this. If that would drive you nuts, then the wisdom of this book may be hard to ingest because it is presented in this sort of playful erudition. The other thing to note is that this book is not designed as a reference book. It isn't the kind of thing where you can flip to the Jewel chapter on dice and just simply extract single points. I think that this book only really works in aggregate because it's building concepts over time. There are useful bits to be pulled from an individual chapter, but it isn't presented or designed as a pure reference book, simply because topics are discussed more fluidly throughout an individual chapter. Kind of hence a lot of these Post-it notes that I used here, these little sticky notes to help ground myself in the locations of things I wanted to talk about. There is a bit of a fluidity to it, which could be good or bad. Lastly, this is not a treatise. This isn't the be-all to end-all of game design, nor does it present itself as that. There will be topics that as you flip through this, you'll think, well, why wasn't that in there? Or they should have talked about this more. And that's natural, because this book isn't attempting to give you the answer to everything. It's attempting to prompt a thinking in you, a thinking about things, so that you are better suited, better prepared to build something of your own. But if you're looking for an omnibus, the dictionary of game design, that's not what Bent Wizards is. So I think we can now answer who this book is for, who would go on this journey of madness. And that line I mentioned at the start is our clue. People who like thinking about things. People who spend a lot of time considering all the little details of game design that aren't necessarily the math, but everything connected to that game design process. So if you're a new game designer, somebody who's thinking of dabbling in game design for tabletop role-playing games, or even board games, this would be applicable, that's the kind of person that I think would benefit from this, because it will guide you through not only some key concepts, but how to approach game design in general, how to be creative and maintain creativity long term. I think this book is also good for more veteran or maybe even jaded game designers like myself, people who have gotten maybe lost in the sauce over time and could benefit from a grounding and refresher of the core concepts of not only game design, but creativity. Like I said, I've been in the tabletop kind of community for decades now, and I've been working on games for a very long time, but I still found this very satisfying and motivating to read. Not because it was unlocking hitherto unknown aspects of game design that I've never heard of, but instead it presented core concepts that I had lost over time in a way that was very ingestible for me, and also helped me approach certain aspects of game design that were weak, like that had atrophied, map making, visual design, and so forth. So I think across the spectrum of game designers, there's value to be had here, but I can't just say like everybody buy this game everybody shouldn't buy this book necessarily, because this book isn't for everybody. So I hope that that description helps clear up what Bent Wizards is. This is a book about tabletop role-playing game design, but about the whole process of design, as a designer, as a creative, and how to think through the various topics that go into making a game, even if this book doesn't tell you how to make the game itself. As always, I hope you found that interesting, right? I think this book is very cool and worth checking out. Now, as I said at the start, I'm not compensated for the sales of this book in any way. I just simply consulted on it. If you'd like to help the channel out, there's a couple ways you can do so. You could like and subscribe this video, maybe share it with others, or you could check out the Tales from Elsewhere Patreon page. That's where we do additional work, and I show a lot of my prototyping and behind the scenes, and all the proceeds of that channel go into the creatives and artwork and process that we use to build games. So links to all that down below. Anyway, hope to see you here next time on Tales from Elsewhere.